Dear friends, in today's Bible reading, you just heard Jesus and those two disciples. There's all kinds of talking taking place and some genuine conversation. And there's a lesson for that in us and insight into some essential ingredients for our lives, our relationships, and faith developments. So have you heard the phrase, talk is cheap? It's an idiom. It's a phrase that applies to someone who promises you something that you do not think will come to be. Talking about something rather than actually doing it makes the talk cheap. My boss says she'll give me a raise, but talk is cheap. You've been promising me a new dishwasher for 5 years now. Talk is cheap. There are many quips that we use for giving talk a bad review. Those who think too little talk too much. Or a dog is smarter than some people, it wags its tail and not its tongue. Talk. We surely don't necessarily uphold it as a virtue. In some contexts, talk is cheap. But in this Bible reading today, Jesus shows us that talking can be one of the richest aspects of our faith and our relationships with each other. Some sociologists believe that we're losing the art of conversation in American life. Eric Hoffer was a social philosopher. He was also an author. He wrote books about conversation and the importance of talking, and Ronald Reagan awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for Literature shortly before he died in 1983. When Hoffer was 5 years old, his mother fell down the stairs with him in her arms, and she died. And 2 years later, at the age of 7, Hoffer suddenly lost his vision. Until his eyesight inexplicably returned at the age of 15, he was cared for by a German immigrant named Martha. Hoffer credits her for learning the importance of talk. He writes glowingly of her. He says, "Martha must have really loved me because those 8 years of blindness as a child are in my mind a very happy time. I remember a lot of talk and laughter. I must have talked a great deal because Martha used to say again and again, 'I remember you said this or that.' She remembered everything that I said. And all my life, I've had the feeling that conversation is important and that what I said and what I thought are worth remembering. She gave me that." Do you know someone who has given you that feeling that conversation is important and what you say is worth remembering? I remember my mother and her sister who would come up from Chicago to visit when I was a child. The two of them would talk for hours on end, sharing rich conversation filled with interest and love. So as I read today's Bible reading from Luke, I see a wonderful conversation taking place. Two men, two of Jesus' disciples were on this long walk, 7 miles, to a town called Emmaus. And while they walked, these two men engaged in a rich conversation. The setting is the evening of that first Easter. Earlier that morning, it was discovered that Jesus had risen from the dead. So can you imagine all the things these men were talking about? Their lives had changed dramatically because of Jesus. And of course, they had many questions and feelings to share with each other. Then the Bible tells us that while these two men were talking, Jesus joined them. And for some unknown reason, they don't recognize him. But the two disciples, they welcome Jesus into their conversation. And in turn, he asks some questions. And the men in turn invite Jesus to stick around, and later on they share a meal together while still unaware of Jesus' true identity. But it was during that conversation at that meal that they finally recognized him. As I look closely at this story of Jesus and these two disciples and pay attention to that conversation taking place, I learned two important things about Jesus that apply to our lives. First, Jesus was a fine conversationalist. He was always engaging people, getting them to speak about things that matter. He wanted to know what their values were, what they saw in faith. And these disciples, after that encounter with Jesus on that first Easter Sunday, they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us?" Jesus, he knew how to engage people in conversation, and it touched them to their hearts. Do you know any fine conversationalists? Think about the attributes they possess. People who are good at conversation know how to balance speaking and listening, interest and emotions, ideas and opinions. They know how to bring about dialogue, and what most of us want from conversation is dialogue and interaction, not just one-way traffic. Jesus did that beautifully in this Bible story. The second thing I learned from Jesus is that he was a remarkably active and attentive listener. Jesus was known to engage all sorts of people, asking questions of government officials and religious bigwigs and politicians and prostitutes and mothers and lawyers and fishermen and even antagonists. It seems that Jesus was interested in everyone, and he wanted to draw them out. Jesus was quite unusual in that quality. While many people that you and I know talk nonstop or talk about themselves too much, Jesus always wanted to hear from people that he encountered, and he wanted to know them as fully as possible. Jesus listened. He heard their emotions. He noted their lack of faith or their faith, and he asked questions to further the conversation. I wonder in our day what effect technology is having on the presence of conversation in our lives. With email and texting and Twitter and Facebook, we now communicate in bursts of abbreviated words, absent punctuation, and snarky comments. And with such means, communication and human interaction take on the electronic equivalent of speaking at one another. So I wonder, when we never have to be physically present with each other to speak together and to build those skills for life-giving relationships, I wonder what that will mean for us. I'm surely a consumer of these new means for communication, and it's true that some communication is better than none. But conversation is profoundly inhibited when it's dependent upon technology. Jesus and those two disciples on that Easter night found their lives drawn together through conversation and also eating together. And on that topic, researchers are showing that our Western culture some time ago has gotten pretty poor about eating together. We don't do it very well anymore. Restaurants are set up to get us eating quickly and moving out, or they surround us with television screens and blaring speakers, and in neither are we encouraged to linger and to enjoy dining and conversation experiences. The problem is, when we lose our capacity for conversation, for dining together, we lose essential channels of grace and life-giving relationships. After those two disciples had had dinner with Jesus and they enjoyed conversation with him, they said to each other, "Didn't it warm our hearts when Jesus talked with us?" We can find our hearts warmed when someone listens to us, gives us the time, shows interest in us. This lesson from Jesus today shows us that through genuine conversation, channels are opened to discover the nature of God present in and through us. That human ability for meaningful exchange with each other is an abiding means of grace. That capacity to share together a meal, it's an important part of seeing how God works in our lives to bring joy and blessing. Such goodness found in conversation and shared dining applies to all the ages. Children need to be cradled in the grace of family structures where time spent together at a table is a classroom for faith development. Studies about teens today and what they need show consistently that young people want opportunities to talk about what matters to them. Conversations with teens and caring adults remains very high on the priority list of most American teenagers. For all of us, conversation is an essential ingredient in reflecting on our experiences of faith and integrating them into our sense of ourselves and God working among us. So I hope that your life is already enriched by the grace of good conversation. If so, thank God for it. And then go out and model that with others. But if you have yet to experience that joy, to know that heart burning within you, reflect again on Jesus in this Bible story. Reread Luke 24 when you get home. Ask God to give you that courage and that ability to be a good listener, to ask questions, to find interest in the lives of others, and finally realize how God is at work in your life through those people who engage you in talk, which is anything but cheap. Amen.